You've been through things. Not the soft, curated version of things that people display at dinner parties when they want to seem interesting. Real things. The kind that didn't come with a lesson attached, didn't resolve cleanly, didn't leave you stronger in any way you could immediately measure. The kind that just happened and kept happening and cost you something you didn't know you were paying until the invoice arrived, and somewhere in your 40s you looked around at the rubble of a few of those things and you noticed something strange. You noticed that the people around you, the ones still running on ambition and theory and the magnificent confidence of people who haven't lost anything important yet, they were asking you questions, not the polite questions. Not the polite questions. The real ones. The ones that start at 11 p.m. when the performance is over and everyone's had 2 drinks too many, and suddenly someone is leaning towards you saying, "How did you get through that?" And you didn't have a clean answer, because the answer is never clean. The answer is something that lives in scar tissue rather than memory, something you know in the body before you know it in words. Here is what they'll never put in a leadership book. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the most credentials. It is not the one with the most confidence. It is the one who has been genuinely, irreversibly broken by something and kept going anyway. Not because they found the lesson, not because they processed the grief, but because going was the only direction that still made any sense. You know what I've noticed? No. Actually, let me put it differently. After 40, pain stops being something that happens to you. It starts being something you carry. And what you carry, if you stop pretending it's luggage, becomes the most useful thing you own. That's what we're talking about today. Let me tell you about the version of yourself you've been trying to explain for the last decade or so. You are not the version that started. You know that. The person who began in their 20s, full of appetite and zero context, that person was interesting in the way all beginnings are interesting. Clean, promissory, theoretically capable of anything. The world was not yet organized against you in any particular way. You had energy and no wisdom. You had momentum and no mass. Then things happened, and I'm not going to list them because you already know the inventory. A failure that defined you longer than it should have. A loss that rewired something in how you read a room. A relationship that ended in a way that permanently altered your understanding of the word loyalty. A professional collapse, maybe? A health event. A decade that simply didn't go the way the plan said it would. The specific catalog is yours. I'm only noting that it exists, that it is longer and heavier than you generally admit, and that it sits behind everything you do in a way that most people in your life cannot see. Here is what happened next, and this is the part that interests me. You adapted. Not gracefully, not with the composed dignity of a person who has integrated their experiences into a coherent personal narrative. You adapted the way everything adapts to damage, by growing differently around it, by developing a thickness in certain places and a sensitivity in others that no one who didn't have the same damage would ever develop in quite the same configuration. And then you walk back into rooms, and you sat at tables, and you led things, and something happened in those rooms that didn't used to happen. People, the right ones, anyway, the ones paying attention, started responding to you differently. Not because you were better dressed, not because you had more authority, because you were present in a way that people without your particular archive of losses are not yet capable of being. You understand failure from the inside, not as an abstraction, not as a case study from someone else's biography. You understand it from inside the chest at 3 a.m. when the failure is all that exists. You understand what it feels like to make a decision with incomplete information and watch it go wrong in slow motion while remaining responsible for the consequences. You understand the specific silence that follows a collapse, the silence that contains all the questions you don't want anyone to ask. And when someone across the table from you is sitting in that silence, someone younger, someone who hasn't been there yet, someone who is in the early raw stage of their own catastrophic education, they feel something when you look at them. Not pity, not sympathy, not the careful, theoretical empathy of someone who has read about this. They feel recognition, a recognition of being seen by someone who has been exactly where they are sitting. Your internal monologue through most of this has been something like, I should be further along. All of this loss should have produced something more visible by now. I've been through enough. Where is the commensurate result? And the part you don't say out loud, was it worth it? Did any of this make me better, or did it just make me tired? Here is what I find quietly hilarious about that question. Not mocking, just genuinely, philosophically amused. The question assumes that better looks a certain way, that it arrives by a certain age, that there is a visible metric for wisdom that you should be able to point to by now, some recognizable output that justifies the cost of the inputs. I once knew a man who had endured more than most. Significant losses, significant reinventions. And he kept insisting his suffering needed to translate into something people could see immediately. Something legible, something that could be announced. The idea that his scars were already doing their work quietly in every room he entered, without requiring a press release. That concept was almost intolerable to him. I found that very human and faintly exhausting. Now, the real question underneath all of this, are you using what it cost you, or are you just carrying the weight of it and calling that leadership? They call it baggage. They call it being damaged. In the more compassionate corners, they call it being shaped by hardship, as if hardship is a gentle sculptor, rather than the thing that took a chisel to your foundation and kept going until something structural cracked. All of these words are Ron G. Every single one. Baggage implies it should have been put down somewhere. Damaged implies the original state was the correct state, and this is a deviation. Shaped by hardship is the polished version, the one you put on a keynote slide that manages to be technically true and emotionally dishonest at the same time. Here is the accurate word. Calibrated. You have been calibrated by experience in a way that cannot be replicated by reading about experience, by studying it, by observing it at a careful distance. Calibration is not damage. It is not baggage. It is the specific tuning that happens to an instrument when it has been played in extreme conditions and is not broken. The tone is different afterward. The range is different. The instrument is not less than it was. It is truer. It resonates at frequencies it couldn't find before. The people who call it damage are people who haven't been tuned yet. They are still factory settings, and they are judging a concert grand by the standards of a piano that has never left the showroom. They call it baggage because they don't yet know what it costs to carry something that heavy and arrive anyway. Point 2, reveal the real origin. Let me be precise about what actually happens when significant pain is processed. And I mean processed in the real sense, not the therapeutic sense, not the journaling your feelings sense, but the actual metabolic sense of what happens over years when you continue living inside the consequences of something that cost you. You develop a specific cognitive architecture that cannot be built any other way. First, you develop a non-academic understanding of desperation. You know what it feels like when the options are genuinely limited. Not inconveniently limited. Not inconveniently limited, genuinely limited. This means that when someone in a room you're leading hits that wall, you don't panic, you don't catastrophize. You don't offer theory. You offer the calm that only comes from having been in the exact room they're in and found the door, not a comfortable calm, a particular earned calm, the kind that comes from having survived a version of the unsurvivable. Second, you develop a high-resolution radar for pretense because when you have been through actual difficulty, performance becomes obvious. You can hear the difference between someone saying something true and someone constructing a sentence that sounds like truth. This is not cynicism. Cynicism is the lazy version. This is discernment. It is the specific gift of having been in enough situations where getting it wrong cost you something irreplaceable. Third, you develop, and this is the one nobody writes about, a genuine lack of interest in credit, because you've been through enough to know that credit is a fluctuating currency with no stable backing. Real leadership, the kind that produces results that outlast the leader, has never been about who got thanked. It's been about who stayed in the room when it stopped being comfortable. Pain doesn't make you a leader. It removes the things that were preventing you from being one. The people who dismiss lived experience as a leadership qualification, who insist instead on credentials, on frameworks, on the reproducible methodology of a system that has never been tested in a genuine emergency, what does their insistence actually tell you? It tells you they are afraid of the thing they can't quantify. There is a very specific anxiety in a technically accomplished person when they encounter someone whose authority comes from somewhere they cannot locate on a resume. They don't know how to argue with it. They can't peer review it. They cannot peer review it. They cannot submit it to a methodology and get a grade back. And what cannot be measured by the systems they trust makes them deeply, privately comfortable. So they reduce it, they call it wisdom, in that tone that means irreproducible, anecdote. They say things like data-driven as a subtle rebuke to anyone whose data is internal rather than external. They build frameworks specifically designed to convert experience into a format that can be managed, categorized, and ultimately subordinated to the framework itself. I have spent time with people who believed that the correct response to any human situation was a sufficiently rigorous process. People who genuinely thought that the right system, applied with enough consistency, could account for all variables, including the human ones. I found that touching. Also, deeply unhelpful when the variables turned out to be human, which they always do. What they cannot measure, they will not trust, which is convenient for them and completely irrelevant to whether it works. Here is what the person who has been genuinely broken and reassembled, after 40, when the reassembly has had time to cure, brings to a room that no credential, no training, and no theoretical framework can manufacture. Steadiness under conditions that are not theoretical. I am not talking about the performed steadiness of someone who has learned to seem calm in meetings. That is a technique. I am talking about the metabolic steadiness of someone who has been in an actual crisis, a real one, with real consequences. That didn't resolve on schedule and has discovered, through that specific education, that they do not, in fact, break. They bend. They lose things. They pay costs they didn't budget for. And then they are still there, still functioning, still capable of making the next decision. That is not a skill you can acquire in a seminar. Add to that the ability to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to resolve the contradictory immediately. This is what experience, gives you that youth almost never has. The tolerance for ambiguity, for the unresolved, for ambiguity, for the unresolved, for the thing that doesn't make sense yet and might not make sense for another 3 years. Young leadership is often desperate to resolve. Mature leadership built on scar tissue, has learned that not everything needs to be resolved. Some things need to be resolved. Some things need to be managed over time, with patience by someone who is not frightened of time. The advantage isn't that you've suffered. The advantage is that you know what's on the other side, and that knowledge makes you impossible to frighten with what's in the middle. Let me draw the line clearly, because the line matters. There is a version of pain as leadership that is genuine, and there is a version that is performance. The difference is not in the pain. The pain may be equally real in both cases. The difference is in what the person does with the authority it confers. The misuse, treating your suffering as collateral, using it to claim a moral elevation that you then use to end conversations rather than open them. Deploying your history as a weapon to establish rank. I've been through more than you, therefore my judgment supersedes yours. This is the scar tissue being used as armor rather than as a map. It protects the person holding it. it does nothing for the room. The ownership, bringing your accumulated experience to bear on someone else's current difficulty. Not to narrate your own history, not to establish credentials, but to provide the specific quality of presence that only someone who has been through something can provide. The quiet confidence that this situation, however bad, resolves. That the person across the table is not going to be destroyed by this. Not because you're reading them reassurance, but because you know the knife held with intent does not announce itself. It doesn't remind the room of all the things it has cut before. It simply does what it was built to do in the hands of someone who has earned the right to hold it. Owning your pain means letting it serve the room, not perform for it. Start with how you describe yourself, to yourself, because I assure you, the current vocabulary is working against you. The old language sounds like this. I've been through a lot. I'm still dealing with some things. It's been a rough few years. I'm not where I expected to be at this point. Listen to the grammar. Every sentence positions you as the object of events, someone to whom things have been done. Someone to whom things have been done, someone still in the aftermath, someone whose present tense is being defined by a past tense. Replace it, not with a lie and not with a motivational slogan, with the accurate language of someone who has been forged rather than merely damaged. I have a particular understanding of how this goes. Not a vague understanding, a particular one. Specific, earned, irreplaceable. My experience with failure makes me unusually useful in this situation. Not apologetically, factually. What I've been through is directly relevant here, not as biography as qualification. The language replacement is not about confidence as a performance. It is about accuracy. The old language was inaccurate. You were not merely a victim of your circumstances. You were shaped by them in specific identifiable ways that produce specific identifiable capacities. Say that to yourself first, in the exact unembellished language of something true. Look at the rooms you occupy, not just the professional ones, all of them, and identify with the specific clarity available to someone who has been through enough to know what costs, which rooms were built to minimize your experience. These rooms have a recognizable temperature. They value the clean, the theoretical, the credential-bearing, the optimistic. They treat certainty as a virtue and ambiguity as a problem to be solved. They applaud beginnings and are made uncomfortable by the complexity of middles and the weight of endings. They reward the performance of confidence and have no mechanism for recognizing the deeper, quieter thing that lives underneath it. You have been showing up to these rooms and making yourself smaller in them, translating your actual knowledge into a format they can accept, softening the edges of what you know so it doesn't disrupt the room's preferred mood. Stop translating. Not aggressively, simply stop. Let the full weight of what you know enter the room with you. The people worth reaching will feel it. They will lean toward it. They always do when it's genuine. The people who don't will continue to prefer the sanitized version, and their preference will no longer be your organizing principle. The next time someone in your professional or personal life implicitly dismisses your experience, treats it as anecdote rather than evidence, as emotion rather than data, as history rather than qualification, here are the only two sentences you need delivered internally. Without speaking them, they are working with a smaller archive than I am. That is their limitation, not mine. Not contempt, not defensiveness, not the urge to prove something. Just a clear, unruffled acknowledgement that the person in front of you has not yet accumulated what you have accumulated, and that their inability to recognize its value is a function of their inventory, not yours. Say it once. Return your attention to the room. Continue. Shift 4. The ownership statement. This is the last shift, and it is the one that restructures everything around it. At some point, not with fanfare, not with a declaration, but in some quiet, private moment that probably looks completely ordinary from outside, stop treating your history as a liability that must be managed and start treating it as the primary qualification you bring to any room you enter. This is not pride. Pride requires an audience. This is something entirely interior, the decision, made once and not revisited, that what you have been through has made you specifically, irreplaceably useful, not in spite of the cost, because of it. The ownership statement, said to no one, required by no one, is simply this: I have earned the ability to be useful in a way that cannot be faked, cannot be taught, and cannot be taken from me. And then you carry that, quietly, without announcement, into every room, into every decision, into every moment where someone needs the specific, rare, impossible to manufacture thing that you have spent years and considerable pain becoming. Here is the architecture of the problem. The world, your professional world, your social world, the broader culture that decides what gets rewarded, was built by people who were, at the time of building, still young, still unscarred in all the ways that matter, still operating on the assumption that the trajectory goes up, that the map is accurate, that the plan will survive contact with reality. They built systems that reward the qualities of that particular season: speed, certainty, the clean articulation of a confident vision, the kind of energy that comes from having not yet lost anything essential. These systems have no column for what you have. There is no checkbox for has survived something that should have ended them and came back with a specific intelligence that only that experience could produce. There is no performance review category for can hold their room steady when everything is on fire, because they have been in that fire and know how it moves. The system was not built for you, and this is not a tragedy. It is simply information. And that you will never be accurately measured by the systems designed to measure people who are earlier in the process than you are. It means that your actual value will consistently register as something other than your institutional value. And it means, and this is the part I find genuinely interesting, that the people who most need what you have will find you anyway. They always do, because what you carry has a particular gravity, and gravity does not require a rating system to function. You are not a cautionary tale. You are not a motivational story. You are something more specific and more useful than either. You are a person who has been comprehensively educated by reality in a curriculum that does not grant degrees, that offers no graduation ceremony, and that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. You have already done the hardest coursework. You did it without choosing to, without knowing you were enrolled, and without any guarantee that it would amount to anything you could name. And yet, here you are, still in rooms, still thinking, still capable of the thing that costs the most to learn, which is being genuinely, unperformatively present for someone else's difficulty because you remember in the body what it felt like to be in it. That is leadership. Not the management of outcomes, not the performance of vision. The willingness to bring the full weight of what you have survived into a room and to let it serve someone who is standing where you once stood. After 40, the scar tissue is the credential. Everything else is preamble. Everything else is preamble.